How's it going, my fellow history scholars? Welcome back to
Oh,
podcast where we talk about unanswered questions of history and unravel the mystery and the many questions about our past. Today, I'm your host, and with me is our special guest, Jason Colavito, who is the author of several books debunking many of the popular phenomena surrounding ancient aliens, classical mythology. He has written extensively about Lovecraft and his literature, as well as recently being published in the New York Times, as well as the New Republic. Jason, thank you for joining us today.
thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I forgot to mention there that you're also coming out with a new book, Legends of the Pyramids. So we can start talking about that. So what's your new book going to be about? It's coming out in August, correct?
Yes, my new book, Legends of the Pyramids, is coming out in August from Red Lightning Books, and it is a survey of the myths and legends surrounding the pyramids of Egypt, going all the way back to antiquity, straight through down to ancient aliens today. It covers all of the strange stories and amazing tales you've heard about the pyramids and takes a look at why people think very strange things about the pyramids and have for a very long time. All sorts of bizarre ideas, from the idea that the pyramids were built as Joseph's granaries for the biblical story of Joseph, all the way to the idea that aliens built the pyramids. People have had a remarkable number of ideas about what the pyramids were really for, and almost none of them have any basis in reality. And yet somehow those myths and legends persist over and over again from antiquity straight down to today. So my book really gives a survey of what people thought at various points in history, why they thought that, and how those ideas merged into one another and built on each other into progressively more extreme and bizarre ideas about the true history of the pyramids.
So why do you think a lot of these stories arise, and what's the interest in taking supernatural explanations to explain this kind of stuff?
Well, that's a great question. In antiquity, they actually knew who built the pyramids. The Egyptians were well aware that the Egyptians had built the pyramids, and even the Greeks and Romans had a pretty good idea of the builders of the pyramids. They knew that they had been built as tombs for the Egyptian kings. They knew, in Greek form anyway, the names of the kings who had built them. And those ideas never really disappeared entirely. The works of Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus were known through the Middle Ages, and it should have been obvious who built the pyramids through all of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and onward. But during late antiquity, when the Roman Empire is starting to come apart, when things are starting to get bad in terms of the social and economic and political cohesion in the area, people are turning to these increasingly more supernatural and spiritual ways of understanding the past. And with the rise of Christianity especially, the idea sort of came about that the pyramids had to fit into a Christian context. And of all the things in the Bible, which covers Egypt and Egyptian culture extensively in its way, the pyramids aren't mentioned. And that struck a lot of late antique and early medieval people as strange. You know, these are the biggest buildings in the world, and they're not in the Bible. Now, why wouldn't they be in the Bible? So explanations were offered by Christians to try to take this very obvious fact that these are the biggest, most impressive monuments in the world and merge that into the biblical narrative. So what you have is this idea that the pyramids have to fit somewhere. So one of the prominent suggestions was that they were the granaries of Joseph, that when there was the 7 years of famine in Egypt and Joseph had built granaries to store the grain to prepare for the famine, that the pyramids were the granaries. Now that should have been obviously untrue, since the pyramids are not hollow, for one thing, and there isn't much room in there to store grain. But it fit into a biblical context, so a large number of people went with it, both because they had this strong belief that they had to be something that was in the Bible, and also this idea that the pagans couldn't be better than the Christians. And if the pyramids were really just the work of pagan kings in honor of themselves, then it would somehow impugn the glory of God because the pyramids were even greater than any of the monuments that the Jews or the Christians had erected. So there's this idea that they have to be folded into the Abrahamic faiths to become part of that religious worldview. And now the granaries myth wasn't the most impressive of the stories that were told in the late antiquity and the Middle Ages, but it was one of the longest lasting. One of the other ideas that became increasingly popular around that time was the suggestion that the pyramids had been built before the flood by the Bible giants, the Nephilim, who were the kings of Egypt, of course, and that they were built as a way of preserving knowledge from Noah's flood. And therefore, they fit into the biblical worldview, not as monuments built by a patriarch, but as these giant pillars of sin from all the evil knowledge of the giants. But these competing views sort of went back and forth for a very long time and inspired a massive number of different ideas about what the pyramids really were. Almost all of the bizarre and occult notions of the pyramids come from one of those medieval or late antique ideas. There's rarely anything that's new in pyramid mythology.
Yeah, so it's almost like taking the already known story. We know how the pyramids were built. Like you were saying, Herodotus told us the story of the pyramids. I think, like you were saying, the main reason that people choose to do this is to fit their own narrative. And that's definitely 100%. They want it to be their own. And you've talked extensively about that with the mound builders myth as well. That was the same thing, this want for ancient American history, because it was relatively new with the Bering Strait compared to the rest of Europe and North Africa.
Yeah, one of the interesting sidelights of history is how these myths sort of emerge and take on a life of their own, in large measure due to their political and social relevance. In the case of the mound builder myth, when settlers from Europe began to colonize North America, they ran across these large earthen mounds. And even though everybody should have known exactly what they were, the native peoples told them, these are mounds our ancestors built. European Americans did not accept that in large measure because they felt that acknowledging that native people had an ancient and worthy culture that was at least on par with the deep antiquity of Europe would compromise this notion that Native Americans weren't really human and taking their land was therefore acceptable. So they invented all sorts of fantastical ideas about who really built the burial mounds, the platform mounds and the pyramid mounds. This took the form of claims that the Vikings had built it, claims that the Jews had come over from Judea and brought the Ark of the Covenant and built the mounds. And it came down to saying the Romans, the Egyptians, the Greeks, it was ancient Scots, Celts, Atlanteans, and eventually we got down to space aliens, but it was really anyone and everyone except Native Americans, because obviously Native Americans couldn't have done it. And this, seems silly, but for a very long time, it wasn't just a wacky idea on the fringes of society, but this is what was seriously discussed in academic journals and in America's newspapers among the cultural elite. 4 U.S. presidents were interested in, if not outright supporters of, the mound builder myth. And Andrew Jackson cited this idea that the mounds had been built by an ancient race that the bloodthirsty Native Americans had somehow eradicated as the foundation for the Indian Removal Act and what became the Trail of Tears. The argument was that if Native Americans didn't build those mounds, then a lost race had done so, and the lost race must have been eliminated by the Native Americans, and therefore Native Americans were not just recent and transient interlopers in American history, but were also dangerous and bloodthirsty and had to be removed from the territory that was being restored to white colonizers, the relatives of whoever that lost race had been.
Right. And I've spent some time over at Cahokia. I don't know if you've heard of that site, but it's a Mississippian, it's this massive Mississippian site with all these huge pyramids. They're absolutely amazing. It's just, you look at this, and then I've done a few digs as well of Mississippian sites and compare it to their artifacts. And it's so hard to believe that you think these people weren't complex enough based off the tools that we know they had, that the time that we know that they had them. It's just, it's crazy that we need some outside source to be able to explain what we already see with a complex amount of technology that the Native Americans had in their own right.
Well, that's the power of motivated reasoning and the power of racism, basically. When people who don't want to believe need to come up with an explanation, they will come up with one, and it's not going to be flattering. It's going to be an explanation that flatters their own ideas about their culture, their lives, and their power. So we see that all over the world. There's the famous case of the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, which everyone ought to have known were built by the native Black African peoples in that region of Zimbabwe. But at the time, Zimbabwe was a colony of Britain and then later a white minority republic. And the white minority government didn't want to acknowledge that. And so they supported fringe alternative ideas that the ruins had been built by the Portuguese or by a lost white race or basically anyone other than the Black Africans. And that was an official government position for quite a while until the Rhodesian government collapsed and was replaced by Black African rule in Zimbabwe.
Right, and I think this is the major theme in your work that I've noticed, at least, is it's taking a lot of these fringe ideas and these movements and showing them that it's not really a matter of taking and twisting a story, but actually trying to find the truth, what actually happened, how these sites actually developed, and that's the source of your new book, Legends of the Pyramids, specifically talking about the pyramids and not that they were built by aliens or were used as Joseph's granaries or something besides what Herodotus literally told us they were used for. So as far as Legends of the Pyramids, what other types of fringe stories, shall I say, do you mention in Legends of the Pyramids?
Well, the one I give the most space to because it was the most influential is one that developed among the Arab peoples who moved into Egypt following the Arab conquest of what had been Roman, later Byzantine Egypt. And they merged native Egyptian traditions with the Judeo-Christian ideas about the pyramids and developed an increasingly and extensively elaborate story about the pyramids' role in salvation history. So more or less how they were both a manifestation of the divine will and also symbols of the Great Flood. The story revolves around the notion that the Great Flood had been prophesied either by the culture hero Hermes Trismegistus or by priests of Egypt. And they had seen the flood coming and ran to build pyramids in order to preserve the ancient knowledge of Egypt from the floodwaters. Now, in this particular telling of the story, the knowledge of Egypt was both divine and evil at the same time. It originated in the revelation that was given to Adam and his son Seth, who had this who had these sheets of knowledge from the heavens that had all sorts of historical, cultural, and magical information. But that revelation had become corrupted by the pagans of Egypt, who had diverted from the true Christian path. Well, they're telling the true Islamic path. They were adapting Christian ideas for an Islamic audience, of course. And so there's this tension in the story between the divine revelation and the sort of evil, pagan, occult knowledge that's mixed in with it, so that the pyramids are simultaneously a divine feat that celebrates the glory of God and also the embodiment of the corruption of that needed to be wiped out by the flood. And so in this story, a king named Surid built the pyramids in order to preserve all the wonders of science and technology from the flood. And in the most elaborate versions of the story, the pyramids are filled with absolute wonders, statues that move by themselves, magic mirrors that can see anywhere in the world, sort of a medieval version of the iPad, I suppose. And what you have is a story that becomes very mythically and culturally resonant. It's so popular that it's repeated in dozens of works of history across the Islamic world and eventually finds its way into Europe. And this story has such power and such resonance because of its connection both to the pagan mysteries of antiquity and also to the Judeo-Christian Islamic notions of Abrahamic religion, that it inspires people in the early modern era right through to today to begin following this story to look for the real secrets of the pyramids. So because the medieval authors associated the pyramids with astrological predictions about when the flood would happen, you see modern investigators deciding that the pyramids had an astrological or astronomical connection to a catastrophic period similar to the flood. Thus, Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, for example, associate the pyramids with the constellation of Orion and the year 10,500 BC. That notion comes directly out of this medieval pyramid myth. And you see people who are hunting for treasure in the Great Pyramid, not because the pyramids have been known to be filled with treasure. They haven't been since antiquity when they were looted, but because the medieval authors wrote about the miraculous treasures that were hidden inside the pyramids. And that legend persists straight down to today. In fact, the medieval pyramid story inspired all sorts of fake ideas about what people think of ancient Egypt. You've probably heard of the legend of the curse of Tutankhamun.
Yep.
Well, the curse of Tutankhamun didn't really come from Tutankhamun. It came from a early 20th century, well, she was late 19th, early 20th century author called Maria Corelli, and she was a fan of one of those medieval accounts of the pyramids. And she took from its story about the guardian spirits of the pyramids that would kill anyone who committed sins inside the pyramid, this notion that the pharaohs had cursed their tombs, and used that to explain how and why Lord Carnarvon had died following the opening of King Tut's tomb. So these old ideas, they don't just stop in the Middle Ages. They keep going today, inspiring one generation after the other. All of the greatest hits of what they like to jokingly call pyramidiacy, the dumb ideas about the pyramids, almost all of them come right out of this mix of medieval myths and legends. And that goes right down to the space aliens of today. The reason people say space aliens built the pyramids is because in medieval times, they said that fallen angels had done so. And the fallen angels became equated with the space aliens.
Right, so it's almost a matter of interpretation, and I know Ancient Aliens has done this, and you've talked about it, the idea that they take these gods that a lot of these civilizations worshipped, and then they transform them into these aliens, even though that may have not necessarily been how the people at the time saw it, because obviously they saw them as these gods that they were to worship, and probably not the interdimensional beings that were told on Ancient Aliens. Yeah,
well,
I think it's a huge matter of interpretation.
That's actually an interesting question, because the stories went through some pretty big shifts over time. All of this originates in the famous story of Enoch and the Watchers, who were the fallen angels who fell from heaven and taught humanity all sorts of arts and sciences, astrology, and for some reason, makeup. They were really big into makeup. I don't know why. It's in the Book of Enoch. But anyway, those fallen angels are the origin point for all of these stories. And what's interesting is that they start out as fallen angels and are supernatural and divine figures. But by late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, you have that view almost universally rejected, and they become transformed into human kings. The names of the fallen angels are given to the fictitious rulers of ancient Egypt and ancient Assyria and so on in these late antique and early medieval chronicles. And what you see is that they took the narrative that's from the Book of Enoch and took out the supernatural aspects and rewrote it by merging the Enochian Watchers and a list of ancient Babylonian kings from the work of the Babylonian priest Berosus. And they took those and made those into the early kings of the tribes of Cain and Seth in the biblical narrative. So you have the supernatural figures turned into human ones. And then what you have is modern people going back and saying, oh, well, there's the same names as the fallen angels. So these myths and legends about humans must have originated in stories of supernatural creatures. And since we know that angels are also space aliens, therefore these are the space aliens. So it becomes almost a circular loop where one myth inspires the other and then goes back to the original in kind of an ever more dramatic and more extreme spiral as it moves further and further away from the origin point toward more extreme and more, I guess we would say, technologically plausible scenarios as modern writers attempt to take old ideas and cast them in new guises that we would today think of as superficially plausible. After all, it's hard to argue with that there's a scientific basis for angels, but it's a lot easier to say that there's a scientific explanation for space aliens.
Right, and I wanted to build off that and then transition into the article that you wrote in the New Republic, because it reminded me of a specific part you wrote about that about the Pentagon actively suppressing UFO work because it feared UFOs were demons and that the research might provoke Satan.
Well, now, to be fair, that is not me saying that. That is the position that several of the people who have been involved in advocating for UFOs have put forward. Lou Elizondo, who was the former head of the Pentagon's UFO program, at least in his telling, he has said on multiple occasions that he ran into opposition in his hunt for UFO information from people placed in the Pentagon who had this extreme Christian notion that UFOs were satanic. And he's not the only one. Nick Redfern, who is an author of paranormal literature, has said that Hal Puthoff and Kit Green, who were members of the team who investigated space ghosts and other oddities for a contractor for the Pentagon, came to him looking for information about what Nick Redfern calls the Collins Elite, which is a probably fictitious organization about that operated inside of the Pentagon and supposedly had these beliefs that UFOs were from Satan and that investigating them would provoke demonic entities. Now, we see that mythology kind of spreading out from this core idea, which I don't think anyone would seriously dispute, that there are evangelical Christians in the Pentagon who associate UFOs with demons. I think that's fairly widespread enough among Christian groups that it's obvious that at least some people do hold that position. But this notion that the group is an organized elite who operate as a kind of cult within the government is a rather extreme interpretation of that. However, that mythology, the idea that there is this cult of people afraid that UFOs are going to spark demon activity, it keeps spreading out from that center. We saw that Jacques Vallée has apparently spoken favorably of it, the famed UFO researcher. And in a podcast a while back, Diane Pasulka, the author of American Cosmic, she talked about how she firmly believes that this Collins elite are operating within the government. And, you know, it's disconcerting to see people taking these ideas that are on the surface absurd and running with them almost entirely without evidence. It's not like anybody's turned up documents or records or even on the record named interviews with people who are willing to say, yes, I'm a member of the Collins elite and I'm combating demons for the government.
Yeah.
In fact, the only person I've ever heard say that specifically was the QAnon shaman in his YouTube video, where he talked about fighting demons and space aliens for he claiming to be a secret soldier for the federal government, operating in the psychic plane in outer space.
Wow. Okay then. That's an interesting take on it. But yeah, I do want to talk about your article because we began talking about it a little bit there. But
yes.
You just came out with an article in the New Republic on how Washington got hooked on flying saucers. And I read it before we did our interview here, and I found it quite interesting because you talk about, again, the UFO phenomenon, how people are trying to find explanations to these things that they can't understand. And it can sometimes be dangerous and detrimental to the way things are by assuming that, oh, the government's hiding stuff from us. There's this big conspiracy going on in the background, and how dangerous that can be. So we can get into your article.
Sure. It's not just that it's dangerous in terms of promoting conspiracy theories, which it obviously is, but also this particular conspiracy theory because of how it originated and what its goals and purposes are. The UFO investigation that the Pentagon undertook in the middle 2000s at the behest of Harry Reid, the former senator who funded it, wasn't initially intended to investigate the kind of flying objects that are buzzing Navy ships and Navy pilots that we've seen in those recently released videos. Instead, it originated in the hunt for space poltergeists on a ranch in Utah at the instigation of a billionaire, Robert Bigelow, who became very wealthy running a hotel chain. And he was deeply interested in the supernatural. And he had put together a team to study whether there was a hole in reality that allowed entities from another dimension to filter into this one, manifesting as poltergeist-like space alien UFOs or other supernatural creatures. And on his ranch in Utah, that's it there, Skinwalker Ranch.
If you guys didn't catch on.
Yes. Skinwalker Ranch, now the site of a History Channel reality paranormal show.
Right.
At Skinwalker Ranch, he not only was investigating these space poltergeists coming in from another dimension, but convinced a scientist from the Defense Intelligence Agency that there really were entities that were filtering in through a stargate or a portal on his ranch. And consequently, the DIA began working with Bigelow to study the supernatural aspects of Skinwalker Ranch, psychic powers, space aliens, space ghosts, and so on. And through the instigation of Robert Bigelow, Harry Reid took that informal cooperation and formalized it in a program that over the next 5 years would spend $22 million, mostly funneled to Bigelow to study space ghosts and related phenomena. And he produced a report given to the Pentagon in which his team, especially Hal Puthoff, Jacques Vallée, and so on, wrote about alien abductions and interdimensional beings and all sorts of paranormal oddities. And according to the New Yorker's article on UFOs recently, when the Pentagon looked at that report, they immediately knew that they couldn't possibly release it because doing so would be a disaster. And I think that about says it all. Everyone, I hope, understood that what they were doing there was Harry Reid's and Robert Bigelow's boondoggle, and that the information, if you can call it that they were producing wasn't really serious science or anything actionable, but was a supernatural paranormal vanity project, basically. And yet somehow this project spiraled into the UFO crisis that the remnants of that team have been promoting to this day, because the Skinwalker Ranch project segued into what became the UFO investigation that became famous in the New York Times when Luis Elizondo took it upon himself to continue the program's work, and when he decided to leave the Pentagon, joined up with the people who had been working on the Skinwalker Ranch project and all of the supernatural things, and they used their connections in the alien abduction world to feed the story to Leslie Kean, a journalist who had been romantically involved with an alien abduction researcher, and it was through that connection that they knew her. And by feeding her the story, they were able to seed it into the media. Through happy coincidence, Kean, due to her connections in the alien abduction world, knew a former New York Times reporter who was writing a book about an alien abduction researcher. His name was Ralph Blumenthal, and he was the one who decided to take the story to the New York Times. And because he had credibility as a prize-winning journalist, he was able to convince the Times that this was not just a good story on the basis that a billionaire had bought himself a space alien research program, but that there was really something more serious to it in terms of an actual UFO mystery that needed to be discussed. And therefore, because of alien abduction of all things, we ended up having the story in the New York Times, and the media coverage that grew out of that legitimized this sort of paranormal boondoggle in a way that previous investigations of UFOs had never seriously been considered in the most elite reaches of the media.
So as far as Skinwalker Ranch, what are your opinions on that? Because I know you've talked about ancient aliens, so I want to see what you think about that.
I think it's fair to say that no one has published or produced incontrovertible evidence of anything paranormal going on at Skinwalker Ranch. The supposed best evidence for it that gets presented on TV and in books and in popular magazine articles isn't terribly convincing and hasn't really withstood scrutiny. Now, the owner of Skinwalker Ranch, he invited me out there last year. He did, yes, Brandon Fugel, the new owner of Skinwalker Ranch. He invited me out there to see for myself and told me that I'd be convinced by the paranormal happenings. Now, I didn't take him up on the offer because I have a little kid and don't really feel like leaving him behind to go scare myself out in a cold, dark ranch for the middle of the night.
Right.
Pretty sure you can see a lot of scary shadows and shapes in your own backyard. Mm-hmm. But it's my understanding that if they had something that they really could prove was supernatural, we would have seen it by now. I mean, they've been researching it for, about 20 years or so, and have produced nothing of scientific value, at least nothing that's been published in a scientific journal or even presented for scientific scrutiny. So I'm not really convinced.
Do you need to get that?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, spam calls, I was hoping they'd hold off for a little while, but unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, it just recently, or fairly recently got aired on TV too. So with that aspect added to it, they're going to dramatize a lot of it, and I think that's just going to make it even harder to find the truth if there's anything out there.
Well, that's the thing with all of these alien, supernatural, and paranormal ideas. You don't really see the actual science. They go straight to television. I mean, what did Lou Elizondo do when he left the Pentagon in a huff, saying that they weren't taking space aliens seriously, taking UFOs seriously? He teamed up with the Space Ghost people, and they took the project to the History Channel to go make a reality show about it.
Is that Project Blue Book?
That was the fiction story. That was a scripted drama. It was Unidentified was the name of the documentary reality series.
They did the same thing with Project Blue Book though too.
Mm-hmm. And the moment that Skinwalker Ranch passed into the hands of somebody who wasn't affiliated with the Pentagon research, it started to become another one of those reality TV circuses. Now, I know Brandon Fugal is very adamant that he was only doing the show because it was going to be treated seriously and with respect, and that he wasn't doing it for the money or the fame and so on. But, it's a reality TV show about hunting the supernatural on your spook ranch. And that's just weird. And it keeps happening. And it keeps happening over and over and over again. Every time how many people are ghost hunters on TV? If you really genuinely thought you had evidence of the paranormal or the supernatural, is going to the Travel Channel or what is it? I don't even know which channel shows all the ghost shows now.
Sci-fi and stuff, sci-fi and whatnot.
Yeah, would your first notion be let's go do a reality TV show about it rather than actually presenting your findings in some way that would have real world consequences? I mean, if you genuinely thought that you had information that was going to transform our very understanding of science and time and space and natural law, I really don't think that a reality TV show is the forum that you would choose to present it.
Right.
I mean, Lou Elizondo was just on Expedition X on the Discovery Channel to go hunt underwater space aliens with Josh Gates. And it's like, you're telling me you want to be taken seriously on an issue of supreme national security importance, and then you're on a reality show hunting space aliens underwater because, serious.
Right. And the other part that I find difficult with it is we reach more people inherently by airing this kind of stuff on TV, but it's not always the attention that we necessarily want, because like you're saying, a reality TV show is not the same as an academic talk or bringing it to the more important authorities if you did have something that was authentic.
Well, certainly. I mean, television is still the way that you can reach the largest audience. Now, it's not as large of an audience anymore. In the old days, when NBC, for example, ran the Rod Serling special presenting Eric Von Donigen's Chariots of the Gods, they were speaking to tens of millions of people. And at that time, that was, almost, I think it was the numbers, it was about a quarter of all Americans watched it. Now, when you talk about Ancient Aliens, they have 1 million viewers, which is 0.3% of America watching that. So, when you run the numbers, it's a very small audience watching any one particular TV show. The power of the media comes collectively. When the same idea airs on multiple channels, on multiple broadcasts, across multiple platforms, that sort of reinforcement creates this idea that this is a serious and important issue, and this is something that is that we need to pay attention to, something that is going to impact us directly. So when the History Channel was telling 0.3% of Americans that UFOs are real, aliens are invading, panic, panic, it wasn't really as impactful as when the New York Times and CBS and NBC and ABC are all telling you that UFOs are invading our skies and this is a national security crisis and we need to do something about it now. When you see that reinforced everywhere at the same time, that agenda setting becomes much more powerful than when it's just one crazy person on some cable channel that almost nobody sees.
Right. Yeah. Cable is definitely going away as it is.
Well, you know, Ancient Aliens is streaming on a couple of different platforms, and Netflix keeps promoting Stephen Greer documentaries and other bizarre alien stuff. They also gave Leslie Kean a documentary about the searching for the supernatural in the afterlife. And HBO Max just announced that they're making a biopic of Leslie Kean, Lou Elizondo, and Chris Mellon and their heroic struggle to reveal the truth about UFOs. They're going to leave out the part about the alien abduction stuff, of course, because, you know, serious.
Right. And you were also in a article in the New York Times as well.
Yes, the New York Times gave me a very nice write-up about my New Republic article.
And I kind of went along the same lines with a lot of what you're talking about with the New Republic article that you wrote as well, right? That it's a lot of this dramatized nonsense that we're seeing in the media and with this pseudoscience. That's quite dangerous.
Yeah, the journalist for the New York Times did a roundup of opinions about the UFO situation and was kind enough to include my opinion in it and placed it almost at the end of the article, where it was more or less an endorsement of my point of view, the parting thought that New York Times readers should be left with. And that goes a little bit of the way toward repairing some of the damage that the New York Times coverage of UFOs has done, devoting so much space and so much time to Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal's ideas without telling their readers how closely they were involved with the To the Stars Academy team, with the Space Ghost people, with alien abduction researchers and so on, was a disservice to readers because it implied that they were neutral, unbiased, and objective observers of the UFO situation, when in fact they are and have been very closely connected to it and very deeply involved in the machinations going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just read the part here where you were mentioned in the New York Times for the people that are going to be listening to the audio portion later. But like you're saying, you were mentioning it, and it's right here. So as amusing as the UFO intrigue is, Jason Colavito argues there is also something quite sinister about how fringe beliefs have been laundered by some of the country's most powerful institutions. Behind the creamy pages of high-end magazines and the marble columns of the Capitol, the media elite and Congress are being played by a small, loosely connected group of people with bizarre ideas about science, he writes for the New Republic. I mean, we were talking about that article earlier. So yeah, it's very upsetting, like I've said, because it makes a dangerous situation with the government where bringing forward these ideas and a distrust for the people who are trying to run the country, ultimately.
Oh, that's certainly true. But it's also the case that this isn't significantly different from what has happened in the past. I mean, as far back as the 1940s and 1950s, you found that there were people who were inside the military and did genuinely believe that there were space aliens invading us. As early as the late 40s, early 50s, you find that some of the people who were working on Project Grudge and Project Sign, the predecessors of Project Blue Book, were actually convinced that flying saucers were space aliens. They didn't really have any evidence for that, mind you, but they felt at the time that military pilots' testimonies had to be taken very seriously, and that there were only two viable explanations. Either space aliens genuinely were invading, or military pilots could be basically hysterical and seeing things. And because they felt that members of the military were trained observers, that they were the best of the best and brightest that America had to offer, they could not therefore be hysterical because, and this was true of the sexist era of the 1950s, hysteria was something for women, and these were big, strong he-men, and you couldn't possibly have hysterical he-men, because what would that mean about military readiness? What would that mean about America's ability to fight the communists? What would that mean about the Korean War? And so there was this group of people straight from the 1940s onward who genuinely felt that because there was no other alternative, it had to be space aliens. And it was born of this idea that we can't question the military, and we can't believe that rational men could have a hysteria that was usually associated with women. And those ideas are still happening today. Now, they dropped a lot of the sexism out of it. Now it's more that the argument is that military pilots are trained observers and therefore can't be wrong. And that argument we saw on 60 Minutes, we've seen in the defenses of the pilot testimony that's going on with the current UFO flap. And, it's not that the pilots aren't accurately reporting what they think they're seeing. It's that cognitive biases, misidentifications, optical illusions, there are many different ways that what we interpret in our heads doesn't necessarily reflect what's objectively occurring in the world around us. But there is this notion that to point that out is to question the military, and to question the military is essentially to question America. And there is this sort of patriotic notion that you can't do that without violating a taboo. And so it comes down to this notion that it's either space aliens or you're not a patriot. And we see Lou Elizondo making that claim, not explicitly, mind you, but he talks about being a warrior for truth. He talks about how UFO believers are the true patriots. And he talks about these things in terms that we would typically associate with a political campaign. Mm-hmm. And, it's uncomfortable when you start politicizing these ideas, and when you start saying that there are certain viewpoints that you can't express because doing so would violate these sort of social taboos. Now, they say, on the other hand, that, talking about space aliens has been a stigmatized taboo forever, except that it's on TV every single day, has been for the last half century. And you have books, magazines, journals, newspapers, you have dramas and movies, and it's there everywhere you want to look.
It's such a part of popular culture now that it's hard.
Yes.
And what are exactly
suppressed, but they're being oppressed and suppressed to the point that, you can hardly find UFOs anywhere except on TV, the internet, and everywhere else. It's ridiculous.
And then what are these pilots exactly looking at? They're these fuzzy images that even with the technology that we have, how can you say definitively exactly what these things are? So,
I'm not a physicist, so I can't possibly comment on the explanations that have been offered for the various objects that have been seen. In my mind, some of those explanations are quite convincing. It's very strange that, according to the recent New York Times report, the Pentagon hasn't come to similar conclusions in their investigation. And it sort of does raise the question of who exactly has been doing the UFO investigations for them and their UAP task force. But in many cases, the issue is, if you see something, there's the fact of what you see, and then there's the interpretation of what meaning you ascribe to it.
Right.
And I don't think anyone's questioning the fact that pilots say that they are seeing white blobs or grainy images on radar or whatever it is that they're seeing. But the issue is the interpretation of that. And it isn't necessarily the case that people who are flying jet planes really fast and trying to make sense of a lot of stimuli happening at the same time are also doing the analytical science that would ascribe interpretation and meaning to the observation. So, what you see isn't necessarily what you get, and that's why we have the scientific method to begin to look into things, and you don't just trust the word of the first person who happens to see something.
Yeah, well, that's the hard part, right? Is we know people are seeing these things. We have evidence that they're seeing these things, but we don't know exactly what these things are, and that's where it gets confusing because we know they're out there, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're aliens or interdimensional beings. It's just something that we can't explain.
Yeah, but these things have historical parallels. In the 1940s, before the first wave of UFO sightings, there were the famous Foo Fighter sightings. But before even that, you see different historical periods, all see stimuli in the sky, but interpret them differently. In the 19th century, they saw things in the sky and interpreted them as blimps. In the early 20th century, they saw things in the sky and called them ghost rockets and thought that they were resembled rockets.
Right.
And prior to that, in the early modern era, when they saw things in the sky and also in the Middle Ages, they looked up and they genuinely thought they saw boats in the sky. And before that, the Romans reported seeing altars and men in togas and even full-on battles with armies in the sky. So yes, people
Constantine in his vision of the cross.
Constantine allegedly saw the cross in the sky.
Right.
But, people have always seen things in the sky. And I can't say what exactly it is that they saw. But what they describe seeing filters through cultural expectations. So in Roman times, it seemed logical to see armies or men in togas in the sky. In the Middle Ages, it was logical to see boats in the sky. In the early 20th century, it was logical to see rockets in the sky. And now, thanks to the myth of the flying saucer, which comes directly out of science fiction, it seems logical to see alien spaceships in the sky or objects that we associate with sort of sci-fi technology, perfectly round tic-tac shaped objects or silvery spheres or triangles, whatever it is. But the bottom line is that how we interpret ambiguous stimuli filters through our cultural expectations of what we think we should be seeing.
Right, and this is not just something we see with trying to understand and interpret UFOs, but it's also something we see with your new book as well, Legends of the Pyramids. Different people seeing the pyramids and interpreting them in different ways and fitting those to their own conclusions. It's a matter of human perspective.
It certainly is.
And with that, we're nearing the end of our time here. So if you have anything else you want to share or final comments, the floor is open to you.
Well, I should probably share the newest example of exactly what we were talking about. You may have seen recently that the former TV paranormal ghost hunter Zach Baggins just spent $382,000 to buy a car part that had originally been part of the Porsche that James Dean crashed that killed him back in 1955. He bought that part and is going to install it in his Las Vegas Museum of Horror and the Paranormal and the Occult in a whole room dedicated to the supernatural curse of James Dean's Porsche and the allegations that this car is not only cursed but has actively been killing, maiming, and injuring people and driving them to ruin for the last 60 some odd years. And it's another situation where this kind of fake lore arises because a bunch of people told a lot of myths. They get folded together and then get recycled over and over again. This particular story originated from a guy who mostly made it up to help make his, increase his book sales and make his investments more profitable. It got filtered through a comic book, which is where a lot of people heard about it and decided that it must be true. It bounced around the internet over the several decades after a long period in tabloid magazines and in books. And suddenly you have this supernatural curse that has no real foundation in fact, but is now going to be a major exhibit in a Las Vegas museum where certainly thousands, if not more, people are going to see it. And suddenly you have an entire story that basically came out of nowhere and got filtered through the media. And because of that repetition, took on a life of its own and is now accepted as more or less true. And that's, another example of exactly what we're talking about with the UFOs, what we're talking about with the pyramids. It's a process that happens over and over again, where somebody makes up a story, it gets repeated often enough, and then it becomes a myth that has the weight of history and legend behind it.
Right. And talking about your book, Legends of the Pyramids, it comes out in August. Where can people find you or go and purchase that book when it comes out?
The book will be available at most major retailers, including Amazon.com or direct from the publisher, Red Lightning Books. You can find me online at my website, jasoncolavito.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at jasoncolavito.
Awesome. And with that, Jason, thank you for joining us today. It was a really great conversation.
It was great talking with you too. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.